Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Ever find yourself wondering why some people just seem to handle stress so much better than others? You know, like they kind of roll with the punches while others get bogged down with anxiety or low moods.
It's a question a lot of us ask, for sure.
Well, today we're going to take a deep dive into some pretty fascinating new research that might actually give us a clue.
Ooh, sounds interesting.
Yeah, we're going to be exploring this newly discovered protein that seems to have a big role in how well we can bounce back from those tough times.
So kind of like a resilience protein.
Exactly. And we're going to be digging into a recent report from Laval University, along with a full-blown scientific study published in Nature Neuroscience.
Nice. So what's the mission for our deep dive today?
Basically, we want to figure out what this protein is, how it does its thing, and what this discovery might mean for, well, all of us when it comes to dealing with stress.
I'm all ears. Let's get into it.
Okay, so the star of the show here is a protein called cannabinoid receptor type 1.
Cannabinoid, huh? That makes me think of, like, neurons, those brain cells that are all about communication.
You're right on the money there. But here's the twist. This research is showing that cannabinoid receptor type 1 isn't just hanging out in neurons. It's also found in these other important brain cells called astrocytes.
Astrocytes. Remind me what those are again.
Sure. Imagine these little star-shaped cells that basically act like support staff for the brain. They help blood vessels talk to those neurons effectively.
Okay, so those astrocytes are kind of like the go-betweens, right?
You got it.
Wow.
Now, to make things a little simpler, we'll just call this cannabinoid receptor type 1 protein, CB1.
Works for me.
And this CB1 is located within something called the blood-brain barrier. You can think of this barrier as the brain's super sophisticated security system, like a filter that carefully controls what gets in and what stays out.
The brain's bouncer, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Professor Caroline Menard, the lead researcher on this from Laval University, she really emphasizes that point.
Okay, I see. So this EZB1 protein is like a guard at the brain's VIT entrance.
You could say that. Now, what really kicked off this whole research project was a pretty intriguing observation. The scientists noticed that the mice who were able to deal with chronic social stress, meaning they didn't develop those anxious or depressed behaviors, they actually had more CD1 receptors in their blood-brain barrier.
More CB1, more resilience. Makes sense.
Right. And they had more compared to two other groups of mice, those that did show signs of stress, messing with their mood, and those that weren't stressed out at all.
So that difference in CB1 levels, it really hinted that this protein might be doing something to protect against the negative effects of stress.
You're totally on track.
Yeah.
And that's what led the researchers to dive deeper. They wanted to know, okay, what exactly is the role of these CB1 receptors in astrocytes when the body's dealing with chronic stress? And then, taking it a step further, they wanted to unpack the mechanisms behind stress resilience at this, what they call neurovascular level, the connection between the nervous system and those blood vessels in the brain.
Wow, they were really going for it. So how'd they go about studying all of this?
Well, they did a really neat study with mice.
Yeah.
And their approach involved some cool genetic manipulation. They used a tool called a viral vector.
A viral vector. Sounds kind of scary.
Not really. It's basically just a delivery system. Think of it like a tiny little package.
Okay, so they use this package to
specifically increase the number of CB1 proteins in the astrocytes of those mice. But, and this is key, they made sure this increase only happened in the astrocytes, not in the neurons.
so they were super precise about where those extra proteins ended up.
Exactly, like a super targeted delivery service for those astrocytes.
Okay, I'm following so far. So they boosted the CB1 in the astrocytes. What happened next?
All right, so after they tweaked those genes, they put the mice through what's called a chronic social stress model. For 3 weeks straight, these mice had these short little encounters, just 5 minutes a day, with a dominant male mouse. Now, there was no physical harm or anything like that.
Oh, so like a social pressure kind of thing?
Exactly. It was a socially stressful environment for them. Professor Menard actually described it as the mice being able to see their bully without actually being in contact most of the time.
Got it. Like a constant low-level threat. So after those 3 weeks, did they check those CB1 levels again?
You bet. They measured the CB1 in the astrocytes, and in the group that had been given that extra boost of CB1, the levels had more than doubled.
Wow, so their little genetic tweak worked perfectly, huh?
Exactly. Now comes the exciting part, the behavior tests. The researchers put the mice through a bunch of tests to see how they were doing. They looked at their baseline anxiety levels, how anxious they were without any stress going on. And then they observed their behaviors after those 3 weeks of social stress, looking for any signs of anxiety or depression-like behaviors.
So basically, they wanted to see how those higher CB1 levels affected how the mice handled stress. What did they find?
The results were pretty amazing. The mice that had more CB1 in their astrocytes, they actually showed lower baseline anxiety levels even before they dealt with any stress.
Interesting. So already less anxious to begin with.
And then, get this, after the 3 weeks of that social stress, those same mice showed fewer symptoms of anxiety and depression-like behavior compared to the other groups.
Wow. So it's like the extra CB1 was giving them a buffer against the effects of stress?
That's the idea. The researchers concluded that having more CB1 receptors in those astrocytes seemed to boost resilience. And they think it works by supporting the health of the blood vessels in the brain. Remember that neurovascular connection.
Right, right. So like the astrocytes with more CB1 are helping the brain's blood flow stay smooth even under pressure.
Exactly. It's like giving your brain's plumbing system extra reinforcement to handle those stressful times.
So it's not just in our heads when we feel better after a workout or something. This research gives a biological reason why that walk or run is actually making your brain stronger against stress, like at the cellular level.
Exactly. And there's another really cool finding. The study also found that mice who were given access to a running wheel so they could exercise as much as they wanted, and mice who got antidepressant treatment, they also had higher levels of CB1 in their astrocytes.
Oh, wow. So that might explain why exercise and antidepressants are so helpful for our mental health.
That's what they're thinking. But the research didn't stop with mice. To see if these findings meant anything for humans, the scientists went a step further. They looked at brain tissue that had been donated after death from the Douglas Bell Canada Brain Bank in Montreal.
So they were looking for similar patterns in human brains.
Yep. They compared tissue from people who had major depression at the time of their death with tissue from those who didn't have depression or those who had been treated with antidepressants.
I'm on the edge of my seat here. What did they find?
The results were really consistent with what they saw in the mice. The levels of CB1 in the astrocytes were lower in the folks who had major depression when they passed away.
So lower CB1, more vulnerable to depression. It's all lining up.
Right. And the levels were higher in those without depression or those who had received antidepressant treatment. So that lends a lot of support to the idea that this CB1 protein is playing a key role in how we handle stress and mood.
Okay, so what does this all mean? Like, what are the potential implications of this research?
Well, one big possibility is that we could see the development of brand new treatments for anxiety and depression. If scientists can figure out how to create molecules that specifically activate those CB1 receptors in the astrocytes, it could open up a whole new way to help people build up their resilience and manage these conditions.
It almost sounds too good to be true. There must be some challenges, right?
Of course. The researchers themselves point out a big one. Broadly activating CB1 receptors, not just in astrocytes but also in neurons, could cause some not-so-great side effects.
Uh-oh, like what?
Things like changes in alertness, even more anxiety, and appetite changes. Not ideal. So the real trick is figuring out how to target those treatments super specifically to the astrocytes and leave the neurons alone.
That makes sense. It's like trying to hit a bullseye, not the whole dartboard.
Exactly. Now, it's super important to remember that every study has limitations.
Right. No study is perfect.
One thing about this study is that the mouse research mostly used male mice. And the Nature Neuroscience paper itself even mentions that chronic stress might affect the blood-brain barrier differently in female mice.
Oh, interesting. So there could be some sex-specific things going on that this study didn't totally uncover.
That's right. Also, while the human brain tissue analysis showed that connection between CB1 levels in astrocytes and depression, we have to remember it was tissue from people who had already passed away. So it's like a single snapshot in time.
Right. So it doesn't show us how those CB1 receptors are changing in living people as they go through stress and depression.
Exactly. We need more research to really understand that dynamic process. Another thing to keep in mind, remember how they used that viral vector to increase CB1 in the mice? Well, that's not something we can easily do as a treatment in humans.
Right. We can't just go around injecting people with viral vectors.
So the next step is figuring out if there are drugs or other interventions that could safely and effectively target the activity of those CB1 receptors, specifically in astrocytes.
Okay, so there's still a lot to learn, but it sounds super promising.
Totally. To get a bit more of a feel for the research firsthand, let's hear from Professor Menard herself. She said their whole idea for this research really stemmed from that initial observation that the resilient mice had more CB1 in their blood-brain barrier, particularly in those astrocytes that help with the communication between blood vessels and neurons.
So that's what really got the ball rolling for them.
And they concluded that having more of those CB1 receptors seems to make the mice more resilient because it promotes better blood vessel health in the brain, helping to maintain that blood-brain barrier even when stress is trying to mess things up.
It's all about keeping that brain plumbing in tip-top shape.
You got it. Professor Menard also talked about the possibility of using molecules to activate those CB1 receptors in astrocytes as a future treatment. She was really excited about it, but she was also very clear that a big hurdle is figuring out how to target just the astrocytes and avoid affecting those neurons.
Right. Back to that bullseye analogy.
Exactly. And one last thing she highlighted was that really cool finding about exercise and antidepressants. They both seem to lead to higher levels of CB1 in those astrocytes, so maybe that's part of the reason they help us feel better and cope with stress more effectively.
Yeah, it's like they're giving those astrocytes a boost to do their job better.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a thought to chew on. This research really emphasizes just how interconnected our physical health and our mental resilience are. Things like how healthy our blood vessels are and how much we move our bodies, they all seem to play into our ability to deal with life's curveballs.
It's like our brain is this complex ecosystem where everything is linked together.
Absolutely. And this research opens up so many cool new possibilities for understanding and maybe even treating stress-related problems.
For sure.
The big takeaway here is that astrocytes, those unsung heroes of the brain, might be way more important for managing stress than we ever thought.
It's like they're stepping into the spotlight, finally.
And that CB1 protein within them. It's a really exciting target for future research and maybe even new therapies to help boost our overall well-being. So stay curious out there, folks, because the world of brain science is always uncovering something new and amazing about how we tick.
I can't wait to see what they discover next.
Me neither. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.